There's one sign above every other sign we've discussed across this entire series that outperforms all the others combined in terms of reliability. A single behavior that, when it appears, indicates ongoing obsession with a consistency almost nothing else can match. It isn't the monitoring, the mirroring, the casual reappearance, or any of the more elaborate patterns we've covered before. It's something simpler, and once you understand exactly why it works as a signal, you'll realize you've probably been overlooking it, buried underneath more dramatic, more obvious behaviors that actually tell you far less than this one does. Let's set up why a single sign can be more reliable than an entire checklist, because this matters before we get into what the sign actually is. Most lists of signs someone hasn't let go suffer from a specific problem. Individually, each sign has plausible alternative explanations. Someone asking about you through mutual friends could simply be polite curiosity. Someone showing up in shared spaces could be genuine coincidence. Someone's social media activity could mean almost anything. Each individual sign requires interpretation, context, pattern matching across multiple instances before it becomes genuinely convincing. The sign we're discussing today doesn't have this problem because it's structurally different from every other sign on every list we've covered. It isn't something they do toward you. It's something that happens inside them, involuntarily, and it's almost impossible to fake or misinterpret once you know exactly what you're looking for. Here's the sign. They cannot maintain a consistent, settled story about why the relationship ended. This sounds almost too simple to be the single most reliable indicator available, so let's walk through exactly why it works and why it outperforms every other sign we've discussed in this entire series. Every ended relationship eventually produces a story, an account, whether shared with others or simply held privately, of what happened and why. For someone who has genuinely processed a loss, moved through it fully, and arrived at real closure, this story tends to stabilize over time into something consistent. Ask them 6 months after the ending, and ask again 2 years later, and the account you get will be substantially the same, told with roughly the same emphasis, the same acknowledged complexities, the same overall shape. This consistency isn't because the story is simple. It's because the internal work of understanding what happened has actually finished, which means there's no ongoing internal negotiation still reshaping the account every time it gets told. Obsession, by contrast, keeps the internal narrative permanently unfinished because a settled understanding of the ending would require accepting the ending as genuinely final. And genuine acceptance is precisely the thing obsession, by definition, hasn't reached yet. This is why someone still quietly obsessed with you will tell a noticeably different version of what happened, depending on who's asking, when they're asked, and what mood they happen to be in that day. Sometimes the story is, we just grew apart, mutual, no hard feelings. Sometimes it's, they were impossible to be with, I'm better off. Sometimes, in a more vulnerable moment, it becomes, I made mistakes I still think about. These aren't necessarily lies in any deliberate sense. They're evidence of a story still actively being constructed and reconstructed because the internal work of actually finishing it, genuinely accepting the relationship is over, hasn't yet occurred. Let's talk about why this single sign is so much harder to fake or misread than any of the more elaborate behavioral signs we've covered in earlier episodes. Monitoring behavior, engineered proximity, casual reappearances, all of these require some degree of interpretation because you're inferring internal state from external action, and external actions always carry some ambiguity about intent. But a shifting narrative isn't behavior you're interpreting from a distance. It's something you can observe directly, over time, simply by comparing what someone actually says about the relationship's ending across different moments, different audiences, different points in the timeline since it ended. There's very little room for alternative explanation once you notice the pattern clearly, because a person who has genuinely settled their own account of an ending doesn't have a structural reason to keep revising it, while a person still quietly working through unresolved feeling does almost inevitably keep revising it, whether they're aware they're doing so or not. I want to walk through the specific forms this narrative inconsistency tends to take, because it rarely announces itself as an obvious contradiction stated in the same conversation. It usually surfaces across time, in ways that require actually noticing the pattern rather than catching a single glaring inconsistency. The first form, the story's assigned responsibility shifts depending on the audience. To one group of friends, the ending gets framed as something they initiated decisively for good reasons. To another group, or in a more private, unguarded moment, the story shifts towards something more passive. It simply happened, nobody's really at fault, or even, more vulnerably, an acknowledgement that they wish things had gone differently. This shifting isn't random. It reflects which version of the story feels safest to tell in each specific context, rather than reflecting a single, stable, examined truth that's simply being retold consistently. The second form, the emotional temperature of the account, changes dramatically depending on timing, particularly around specific triggers, anniversaries, mutual encounters, moments when your name comes up unexpectedly in conversation. A story that's usually told with flat, settled indifference suddenly, in these specific windows, becomes noticeably more emotional, more detailed, more invested, before settling back into the flatter, more distant version once the trigger passes. This fluctuation reveals something the flat, default version was actually concealing: real, unresolved feeling that surfaces under specific conditions but gets suppressed back into a more comfortable, protective account the rest of the time. The third form, and one of the more revealing versions, the level of detail included changes significantly depending on how recently the story is being told relative to some new development in your life that they've become aware of. If they've recently learned something about your life, a new relationship, a move, a success, and the story of the ending gets retold shortly afterward with new details, new emphasis, or a noticeably different framing than it had before that information arrived, this reveals that the account isn't actually stable at all. It's being actively recalibrated in response to new information about you, which only makes sense if you're still occupying real, active space in how they're processing their own narrative, rather than having genuinely settled into the past the way a truly finished story would have. I want to explain why this single sign, once recognized, tends to be so much more useful than trying to track the more elaborate behavioral patterns we've discussed elsewhere in this series. Behavioral signs require you to actively watch, monitor, and interpret ongoing actions, which itself keeps you tethered to paying attention to someone you're trying to detach from. The narrative sign, by contrast, requires almost no ongoing monitoring at all. It typically reveals itself passively, through second-hand information that reaches you without any effort on your part. A mutual friend mentioning in passing a version of events that doesn't match what you heard from a different mutual friend months earlier, or what you heard directly years ago when the relationship actually ended. You don't need to investigate anything. The inconsistency simply becomes visible, on its own, through the ordinary channels of a shared social world, without requiring you to actively seek out confirmation. I want to say something important about why this sign matters more for your own clarity than for any practical action it might suggest you should take. Recognizing that someone's narrative about your relationship has never actually settled doesn't mean you should reach out, doesn't mean the door should reopen, and doesn't mean anything about what you owe them in response. What it does mean, and this is genuinely valuable, is that you finally have an accurate, reliable answer to a question that often lingers long after a relationship ends. Did any of this ever actually register with them? Or was I simply forgettable, easily processed and filed away without a second thought? A narrative that's still visibly unsettled, years later, tells you clearly that no, it wasn't simply forgettable. something about it remains genuinely unresolved for them, whether or not that unresolved feeling ever gets acknowledged, communicated, or acted upon in any way that reaches you directly. I want to be careful here, because this entire episode could easily be misread as flattering, as proof of how significant or unforgettable you were. And I want to name directly why that framing, while understandable, misses the actual point. The value of recognizing this sign was never about validation. It's about accuracy, replacing the vague, uncertain wondering that often persists after a relationship ends with a clear, evidence-based understanding of what's actually happening, rather than continuing to guess based on incomplete, ambiguous information. And this is exactly where we're headed in the second half of this conversation. What actually determines whether this unsettled narrative eventually resolves into something stable, why some people carry this exact pattern for the rest of their lives without ever reaching genuine closure, and why understanding this single, reliable sign gives you something far more valuable than any of the more elaborate behavioral patterns we've discussed throughout this entire series. A clear, low-effort way of finally answering the question you've likely been asking for a long time, without ever needing to actively investigate, monitor, or engage with someone you've already rightfully moved on from. Let's talk about what actually determines whether this unsettled narrative eventually resolves into something stable, because this is where the pattern either finally completes into genuine closure or continues indefinitely, sometimes for the rest of a person's life, without either possibility being obvious from the outside until you understand the specific mechanism underneath it. Here's the first determining factor, and it connects directly to something we discussed in earlier episodes about the search for replacement. Whether a narrative ever gets the chance to settle depends heavily on whether the person doing the telling ever actually sits with the ending long enough to process it fully, rather than moving quickly into distraction, a new relationship, or simply refusing to revisit the topic at all, except when directly prompted. A narrative that never gets deliberately, honestly revisited has no mechanism by which it could settle, because settling requires actual internal work, sitting with the specific memories, examining them honestly, arriving at a stable understanding, rather than continuing to react differently to the same underlying material, depending on mood, audience, or circumstance. Someone who avoids this internal work entirely, filling every available moment with distraction rather than reflection, can carry an unsettled, shifting narrative for decades, simply because the conditions required for it to settle were never actually created. The second determining factor, whether life produces enough repeated occasions to actually tell the story, forcing enough repetition that inconsistencies become visible even to the person telling it. This might sound counterintuitive. Wouldn't telling the story more often simply mean more opportunities for inconsistency to appear rather than fewer? But repetition, over enough time, often does something valuable. It forces a person to notice themselves that their own account keeps shifting, which can eventually prompt the kind of honest self-examination that finally produces a stable version. Someone who rarely discusses the relationship's ending at all, avoiding the topic almost entirely, never actually encounters this forcing function, which means the unsettled narrative can remain permanently unexamined, simply because it's rarely enough retold for its own inconsistency to become obvious even to the person carrying it. The third determining factor, and one of the more significant ones, whether new information about your life continues arriving indefinitely, or whether it eventually stops, allowing the narrative to finally settle around a fixed, unchanging set of facts, rather than constantly needing to be recalibrated around fresh updates. This is worth understanding because it explains something that seems paradoxical at first. Sometimes the healthiest thing that can happen, from the perspective of the person still carrying an unsettled narrative, is losing access to ongoing information about you entirely. No mutual friends providing updates, no visible social presence to check, nothing left to recalibrate the story around. Without ongoing information, the narrative eventually has no choice but to settle around whatever it was at the point information stopped, because there's nothing left feeding its continued revision. I want to talk honestly about why some people carry this exact pattern for the rest of their lives without ever reaching genuine closure, because it's worth understanding this outcome clearly rather than assuming everyone eventually settles given enough time. Some people structure their entire lives around avoiding the specific kind of honest self-examination that settling a narrative actually requires, not just regarding this one relationship, but as a broader pattern across every difficult experience they've ever had. For these people, an unsettled narrative about your relationship isn't really about you specifically at all. It's simply one visible instance of a much larger, more pervasive avoidance of genuine self-reflection, one that would likely be present regarding almost any significant loss or difficulty in their life. Not just this specific one. Recognizing this matters, because it removes any temptation to interpret a permanently unsettled narrative as evidence of how uniquely significant you were. It's often simply evidence of how this particular person handles difficult material in general, regardless of who or what it involves. I want to address something important about what this means practically for your own life, because understanding this entire mechanism was never meant to become a new form of ongoing monitoring, even a passive one. If you find yourself checking in, even occasionally, on whether the narrative has finally settled, whether the story has finally stopped shifting, you've simply replaced active monitoring with a subtler, more patient version of the same underlying dynamic, still organizing some portion of your attention around confirming something about someone else's internal process, rather than genuinely redirecting that attention toward your own life. The actual complete version of moving forward doesn't require ever confirming whether their narrative settles. It requires releasing the need to know entirely, trusting that whatever process is happening on their end, whether it resolves in 6 months or never resolves at all, was never something your own peace needed to depend on. I want to say something important about why this entire 3-part exploration across our conversations, this sign, along with the others we've covered, was always secondary to something much more foundational, which is your own relationship to the question itself. The healthiest possible outcome isn't successfully identifying every sign, becoming skilled at detecting inconsistency in someone else's narrative, or building an increasingly sophisticated understanding of exactly how obsession manifests in people who claim indifference. The healthiest outcome is reaching a place where the question itself, are they still thinking about me, still obsessed, still unsettled, simply stops mattering enough to require an answer at all, because your own life has become full enough, engaged enough, and oriented toward people who are actually present with you, that whatever's happening in someone else's unresolved internal world no longer has any meaningful bearing on your own. I want to leave you with an image, because I think it captures everything we've walked through across both halves of this final episode in this particular series. Picture a musician, once part of a duet, now playing alone, years after the partnership ended. For a long time afterward, whenever asked to explain why the duet stopped performing together, this musician tells a different version of the story almost every time. Sometimes it was creative differences, sometimes it was simply time to move on, sometimes, in quieter moments, an admission that something more personal, more painful, actually happened between them, something never quite resolved even now. The story shifts because the actual piece of music they once played together was never actually finished being written. It ended abruptly, mid-composition, and every retelling of why it ended is, in its own way, still trying to compose an ending that never actually got completed the first time around. Meanwhile, the other musician, the one who used to play alongside them, has long since moved on to an entirely different composition altogether, one built without needing the first duet's unfinished piece ever to resolve, one complete and coherent entirely on its own terms, requiring no explanation, no shifting narrative, No ongoing negotiation about what that earlier collaboration actually meant. This musician doesn't need to know whether the old piece ever gets finished by the person still quietly working on it somewhere else. Their own music is already whole, already playing, already reaching an audience that has nothing to do with whatever unfinished composition still occupies someone else's attention, somewhere far away, on an instrument this musician no longer needs to hear. And here's what's true about unfinished music, left in someone else's hands, long after you've stopped needing to hear how it resolves. It may finish beautifully, eventually, arriving at a stable, settled conclusion after years of quiet, difficult work. Or it may simply remain unfinished forever, revised endlessly, never quite settling into anything complete, carried indefinitely by someone who never quite develops the capacity to finish what they started. Either outcome is possible, and neither outcome changes a single note of the composition you're playing now, complete and whole, requiring no resolution from anyone else's unfinished work in order to be exactly, fully, entirely your own. You were never responsible for finishing their composition. You were only ever responsible for finishing yours, and somewhere along the way, without needing anyone else's permission, or anyone else's closure, or anyone else's finally settled story, you already did.